Over and above simple filtering, equalizers can both boost and cut specific frequency ranges. There are three main parameters that are available to tweak an individual frequency range, which is called a band, and most EQs have at least two or more bands that can be addressed simultaneously. The parameters for each band of EQ are center frequency, gain, and Q. Gain controls the amount of level, boost, or cut you can apply to that particular frequency band. Center frequency sets the frequency in the middle of the range affected by that particular EQ band. And Q is the bandwidth above and below the center frequency. How wide or narrow a range of frequencies will be affected when you boost or cut in that band. Some EQs have a lot of bands, from 10 to as many as 30, but the center frequencies in Q are fixed, leaving gain the only adjustable control for each band. This type of configuration would be a graphic EQ. They're commonly used in applications like sound system installations, where you might need to make a lot of slight adjustments at a lot of different bands. The one you're looking at right now is the graphic EQ in iTunes, but studio and DAW mixers require more flexibility. They usually need fewer bands per track, 3 or 4 most commonly, but professionals want at least some degree of control over all the parameters I mentioned in each band. EQs that provide this are called parametric equalizers, and they're what you'll be using 99% of the time for recording and all types of mixing. The EQ I demoed the 3 parameters on a moment ago is, of course, a parametric EQ. The Channel EQ plugin, which happens to come with Logic. As you can see, this EQ has 8 bands in all. The middle 4, bands 3 through 6, are standard parametric EQ bands where you boost or cut a range of frequencies around a center frequency. The way these bands affect the sound, which you can see in the graph, is sometimes called a peak and dip response, or a bell curve. The 2nd and 7th bands are shelves, or shelving bands. They boost or cut all frequencies above or below a corner frequency, kind of the equivalent of a cutoff frequency in a filter. But the boost or cut levels off eventually based on the Q setting. It forms a shelf. This is how the typical bass and treble controls on a hi-fi work. The outer bands of this EQ are, respectively, a high-pass and a low-pass filter, which I covered previously. As with most EQs, each band can be enabled or disabled individually, and the frequency response graph displays the changes you're making to the sound. Watch and listen as I make some tweaks to a couple of tracks, and take note of what the different frequency ranges sound like as I boost or cut them. But remember, the overall tonal balance you hear is not just the adjustments you're making and seeing on the graph, but those adjustments on top of the balance of the harmonics and overtones that make up the original sound, and the instrument resonances that are part of that sound. Some EQs will let you see this as well. This one's one of them. It includes a spectrum graph, which you can switch on, which will show you the actual tonal balance of the instrument both before or after you apply the EQ. Remember, I showed this kind of graph briefly in the earlier course. This can be really informative, even for experienced mixers, helping to pinpoint where in the original sound wave there might be prominent resonances, areas of tonal emphasis or de-emphasis, and whether your EQ settings are being made at the best frequencies to address whatever you may want or need to change in this particular wave. If an EQ plugin doesn't have a spectrum graph, a separate plugin can be used. Here's the Blue Cat spectrum graph, which provides the same display and can be used in conjunction with any EQ plugin. But if you're setting out to apply EQ for traditional creative purposes, how do you decide which frequencies to tweak if you want to add punch to a bass or snare drum, or lend a bright sheen to cymbals or an acoustic guitar, or get rid of an objectionable tubbiness in a kick drum? Well, ultimately this comes with experience, but there are a few guidelines that can help you get started, which I'll touch on briefly in the next tutorial.